Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to FPF for the invitation. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you. As a student of science, we always want to find opportunity to collaborate. And if we collaborate, I think that has to preceded by building connections. And before that, we always have to have some conversation. And I hope this is so very appreciative of this opportunity. So this was a title in the program, and I liked because supply chain communication itself is a very dear topic of mine. I like to take that opportunity to talk about that first. So I will speak on risk communication in the supply chain. This is more about ensuring compliance. And then I will come back to the part about product safety. That's more about assuring safety. So ensuring compliance and assuring safety, I think, are two different domains that I think can be covered best separately. So what I want to talk about is a work that's been mentioned at Food Packaging Forum on some newsletter in the past, is this guideline for risk communication for the global food supply chain. And what is this? I have a hard copy here. The impetus of this really began, for many of you here, you know Anna Schaefer, and she was asked at a conference in the US, what's the best feature of the European system? It was a panel, and then there was a speaker from the US, and then what's the best feature of the US? And then Schaefer's response is, our best part of our European system is the system of declarations of compliance. And the FDA speakers say the best part of our system is a food contact notification system. So that really kind of inspired me to think there is a lot that to be done about it. So why risk communication? I think it matters because risk analysis is why we're here. Risk analysis is universal to public health. Risk analysis is in Codex, is in the FDA, and it's also in the EU regulations. So this is universal to public health. Doesn't matter you're in UK or US, UAE, you name it. You know, risk analysis is the starting point for all our conversation. And I think at the same time, all three mention that there are three components to risk analysis. It's always risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. There are three parts to this, just like there are three quarks to a neutron or proton. If you take one out of it, it ceases to be the neutron or the proton. It has to be coexist at the same time. Risk communication is integral to risk analysis. So the way I look at it is that in a supply chain situation, your risk assessment is only as good as the risk communication that you receive. Because garbage in, garbage out. If you're not getting good risk communication, your risk analysis is meaningless. Risk management, so risk assessment concerns what you buy. Risk management concerns what you make. Risk communication concerning what you sell to the next person. So invariably, your risk communication is always to somebody else that buy your product. Look at risk communication by itself. There are always three elements at least. The way I look at it involves the people, involves the process, involves the content. The challenge with people is that the supply chain, this is a very simplified way to look at the supply chain. The substance turns into materials, turns into article that is combined with the commodities, ingredients, and additives of food to make it a processed food to become a retail food. This is a very protracted, extended supply chain. Whoever writes what a communication seldom knows whoever is receiving it and reading it at the end. This is a challenge. The other thing is a matter of perspective. People that are working in a food supply chain routinely get audited, and they are not, they invariably had to have some oversight and do some GMP audit on the food contact articles. So, there is some need for better understanding and perspective. The other aspect is the process. If you look at it, this is a very classical communication model when it was at the infancy of telecommunication. It says that you always have a prepared message that needs to be encoded, has to be transmitted, has to be decoded before it gets received. This is a very simplified model that's assuming there is no feedback, assuming there is no distortion, there is no noise. As you can see, if you look at this process, every step you will lose some fidelity. By the time you get to the end, just in a simple step, you will lose quite a bit. That's also a challenge. In terms of content, I think that further can be broken down to smaller elements because it's always concerned the text, the context, and the structure of the statement. So whether the text is precise, whether the context is defined and understood, and whether the structure is streamlined and consistent. These are all important for us to communicate at the operations side. Because of that, I was chairing a group called Project Passport. As I mentioned, we tried to bring together at the version 1 the US and the EU regulations and try to make sense and put it side by side and put it into a communication framework. This document was first published in 2015, has been updated in 2017. And because of all the hyperlink in there, it's probably best if you just download it if you want and use it for whatever purpose. So very quickly, it provides a syntax. It doesn't say everybody has to use this form, but just say it provides a way to think through the issues. A syntax is better than not having syntax at all. If you do coding, or just any-day writing, you have to accept that syntax matters. Oops, what did I do? All right, good, wrong button. The other thing is that context is extremely important. If people don't know whether you're supplying a substance which is valued for its purity to a certain standard, or whether it's a material that's formulated for its complexity, or its packaging that's sold for its utility, then it's hard to establish a basis for communication. So clear distinction between food and food contact is helpful when you transmit that information. The other thing is that language matters, the text matters, so because of that, there's some suggested language for people to consider using in their preparations of DOCs. Because it's meant to be useful beyond just, it's really intended to help the US manufacturer, but we adopt the ideas of DOC from the EU. We also want to genericize it. So everything from regulatory standpoint about food contact can be boiled down to, again, further, I like the number 3. 3 elements: safety, quality, and suitability. Safety in terms of framework and specific measures, quality in terms of GMP, and suitability in terms of any kind of limitation that you want your buyer to be aware of. Also important is to prioritize the informations. You want the headlines to be headlines. You want sports news to be in its proper place, weather to in the proper place, stock market quotes to be in its proper place. You want this, a building hit by a plane, you want that to be at the beginning. So the way we prioritize it in this framework of communication is put food contact compliance in front of non-food contact compliance, in front of issue management, things that customer wants to know, you want to assure, but it probably should be stated in a sequentially after the compliance matter have been addressed. And just to help people, there are various guides that are linked to various FDA and EU documents and guidance documents. So it's a way that was developed to help business, SMEs. I think there are enough information on the US and EU to make this useful. The goal is to go beyond the US and EU and resource permit. We probably will try to take on Chinese regulations to incorporate that. So that's very quick on this front. Going on, I want to share some thoughts on packaging safety and challenges. And in my mind, well, first of all, I should say at the beginning, I'm only speaking for myself. I'm employed by Coca-Cola Company. I don't speak for Coca-Cola Company. Yeah. So previously, I was talking about what the work done by the Trade Association. This is some of my personal thoughts and perspective. I hope is something that we can provoke conversation and have, that it will be great. So I will structure my talk as follows. I will talk about packaging, and then safety, and then talk about challenges. All right? First of all, first of all, what is packaging? We're very familiar with this Annex 1 of the framework regulation. You have 17 food contact materials, and it doesn't, the best I can tell, there's no wood, there's no bamboo for the Chinese. So anyway, it's interesting that, this clearly reflects a European mindset, not only in terms of the specific listing, but also in terms of the Napoleonic code nature of this kind of explicit listing, right? In the US, there's no listing, but instead it's a legal definition. I don't ask you to look at the definition, but what I like about it is that it introduced the concepts of intended use, inertness, connection to food, and the hierarchy of the supply chain. And basically restructure that sentence in the legal definition into substance, materials, everything that's for packaging, intended use, technical effect. What I like about it, as I mentioned earlier, in a supply chain, everybody has a role, everybody has this value proposition. If I'm making terephthalic acid, my goal is to make it as pure or as adherent to a published standard on its purity. If, on the other hand, I'm supplying you a polyester resin that has certain characteristic, there's a lot of formulary knowledge and know-how that's been put in, has a lot of complexity in there. And finally, if it is bottle, it's about the physical utility. So what's interesting is that because of that there are a lot of specialists, and between the food and the non-food, you can see that the people that are involved are quite different between the food ingredients and food packaging. That, because everybody is specialist, everybody become embedded in their own language, it creates yet a kind of challenge is that we are familiar and we kind of are not so familiar with other people's special vernaculars and special lingos. That's what I'm trying to illustrate here. To make a point about safety, I want to come back to a little bit on harmonization. I want to use an example. This is a material that I think clearly illustrates between the US system and the European system. This terephthalic acid, this is pointer. So you have acid and an alkyl, and then if you add a secondary diol, it's called spherical glycol or SPG, you can make certain unique polyester that can withstand very high temperatures, such as boiling water. So, as regulated in the EU, EFSA gave an opinion in 2014. It says good for all foodstuffs, for all temperature, and then sets an SML of 5, and then an oligomer limit of 50 microgram per kilogram, so 0.05. So Commission last year turned it into a regulation. It became effective, but you see the complexity, thank you, is that it needs a well-described method, it needs competent authority, it needs adequate method, it needs calibration sample. All the things that we have been talking about. The compliance challenge in this system is tremendous, because if you ever want to use it, you need to provide competent authority, your method. If we've heard from JRC, some of these don't have methods, don't have calibration standards. This is this is no trivial task for JRC, certainly no trivial task for people making it. Now, by contrast, the FDA requirement is a lot more, is as follows. It was issued back in 2012, looking at the same dossier, looking at the same sets of tox data, same sets of migration data, and what the FDA say, your limitation is no more than 5 millimeter for single use and repeat use, and based on your stoichiometry, you can use either at hot fill or you use in boiling condition. You see the dramatic difference between these two, starting from the same sets of data, come out with very different prescriptions. So they both determine things to be safe. Both have laid down safety parameters. But the safety parameters are distinct from one another. Right? One is a posteriori chromatography. You need to do migrations of monomers and oligomers. In the in the US, is a priori stoichiometry, which you know when you make it, and is basically take a micrometer and measure the thickness. Then you establish compliance or meet the safety. You see, that's one thing to consider. The other observation I like to make is that I don't want to get into the issue of threshold or no threshold here, or monotonic, non-monotonic, but generally speaking, simplified baby toxicology that I can understand is that you draw the data and reach a point of departure, you bax 100 or 1,000 to get to ADI or TDI, and then to establish this number. Now, you have TOR in the US called threshold regulation. This number simply says in the regulation, say if you know the ADI, you can divide that by 100, and if you are below that, you can say it's below the threshold regulation. What's interesting is that food contact and flavoring are more or less couple orders of magnitude, generally speaking, at this below the ADI. Together, here's the issue. The systematic incongruence creates compliance gap. Here is a mouse, and we have several orders of magnitude away from the mouse. But if one draws a circle, the other one draws a square, you invariably create gaps. And these are compliance gaps, but they are not safety gaps, I will argue. But just to make it fun, say we have a circle and a square, A2 square and pi r square. You probably can memorize pi to 20, 30 decimal points. You probably never thought about memorize square root of pi or 1 over the square root of pi. And if you want to know what 1 ppb of square root of pi is, it's about here. So I like to just raise some questions so we can answer the questions later together. So this is just question. I'm not going to draw a conclusion at this point. Which is more protective? Okay? Can we communicate safety in a way that transcends geopolitical boundaries? I think that will be a worthwhile goal. That's my question number 1. I hope that's something you will ask later on, and we can discuss it together. What is more helpful when we communicate is another question. Can we communicate message with clarity and empathy? Empathy relates to something that's specific to the people that are listening to. I think a lot of time we probably, because of lawyers, and we just always stay on the applicable realm and never get into the details of these are applicable, but as far as we know, as far as we can relate to you, as far as what we know as a product steward, you are probably in a different part. I think this is a helpful conversation, and that's something we probably should consider discussing. Last slide. Because of the last morning presentation on philosophy, I thought I inserted this. What is most effective? This is classical philosophy, the discipline epistemology. Epistemology is a study of knowledge. Episteme is a Greek word for science. So here's the issue. Today, whatever we can act on is a matter of knowledge, but knowledge has to pass through a threshold of truth, data, and evidence that has to be filtered by belief, has to be filtered by justification. That's the challenge today, because a lot of time when we communicate, in my mind, is that there is not a receptive framework before we communicate. So people are asking for a lot of information. I think they're asking for data when in fact they're really yearning for knowledge. We need to recognize whether it's a knowledge gap or a data gap. If we can discern that, I think it will also help our communication. So just some thoughts for us as students of science to build some collegiality. I think that's something I hope we can all identify. So thank you very much.